everyone, and welcome back to the Tales from the Castle podcast. My name is Blythe.
Hi, and my name's Gwen.
And we are very lucky today to have back our special guest, Dave, the Castle Tour Guide.
Hello, thanks for having me back.
Today we're going to be talking about Robert the Bruce, and I think most of you will know a fair bit about this guy, or you will have heard of him, or perhaps you've seen Braveheart. So while that's a lovely film, I would strongly encourage you to seek your historical information elsewhere. Today's piece isn't going to be too long. We're just going to be going off the back of the first piece that we did on the personality of Robert Stuart, or King Robert II. And what we found in that sparked some conversation on Robert the Bruce's legacy, especially what was picked up by his two living heirs. So as usual, I'll start with some background on Robert the Bruce. So don't worry if you don't know much about him, or if everything you know comes from Braveheart.
I think it's really important when we're discussing Robert the Bruce to start with the succession crisis. So we'll go back a little bit further than Robert the Bruce's reign to 1286, when King Alexander III of Scotland dies, and he passes the throne to his granddaughter, Margaret, the Maid of Norway. And Margaret is his granddaughter through his daughter, Margaret, who is married to the King of Norway at that time. Margaret is only 3 when she inherits the throne of Scotland, and she stays in Norway for a few years still, while Scotland continues to be ruled by a group of 6 guardians. And in August of 1290, so 4 years later, a treaty was signed between the 6 guardians of Scotland and the King of England, which agreed to a marriage between Margaret, the Maid of Norway, and Edward I of England's heir, Edward of Carnarvon, which essentially meant that in the future, the King of England and the Queen of Scotland would be married, but this treaty also specified that Scotland would remain its own independent nation. However, this treaty was rendered null and void when, in October of 1290, Margaret took ill and died en route from Norway to Scotland at the age of 7, leaving Scotland without a clear heir to the throne. Many claimants for the throne came forward, though the two with the best claims were Robert the Bruce, Lord of Annandale, and John Balliol, Lord of Galloway. And unable to choose the rightful claimant peacefully, the Guardian sought the help of Edward I of England, who intervened and eventually chose John Balliol as king, as he believed that Balliol would best serve England's wants and needs. And Edward I soon discovered that this wasn't to be the case, as John often went against England's wishes and yet still somehow proved unpopular in Scotland, and he was forced to abdicate in 1296. Now, by this point, the original opposing claimant, Robert Bruce V, had died, and technically his claim now belonged to his son, the 6th Robert the Bruce, while Balliol was first imprisoned in England after his abdication and then sent to France. The following years saw chaos in Scotland as Edward I of England pursued a full-blown war against the Scots. In 1304, the 6th Robert Bruce also passed away, leaving us with the last and most famous Robert the Bruce, who was eventually crowned king in a rushed coronation at Scone on the 25th of March, 1306. But Robert the Bruce's road to the crown wasn't straightforward. In fact, in the early years of the 14th century, Robert appeared to switch sides, fighting at one time for the English and at one time for the Scots, seemingly in an attempt to win ground or favor, which might help him to gain the Scottish throne. And on the 10th of February, 1306, just 6 weeks before his coronation, Bruce and a small retinue murdered his arch-rival John Comyn in a church at Dumfries. Only a few months after Robert's coronation, his loss at the Battle of Methven, a battle which had been brought on largely by John Comyn's murder in the first place, caused Robert and his forces to need to move west, and his new wife, Elizabeth de Burgh, his sister Christina, and his daughter Marjorie from his first marriage, all to flee north to Kildrummy Castle, where they would all soon be captured and imprisoned in England for the next 8 years. Despite Robert's rather bloody and, to be honest, slightly shady start, he would go on to be remembered as a king who sacrificed much for Scotland, with both of his brothers killed by the English, his women captured by the English, and he himself spending nearly his entire reign either in hiding or actively fighting Edward I, with the First War lasting until March of 1328, only 15 months before Robert's death from leprosy in June of 1329. In the time between his coronation and the end of the war, Robert won, among others, the Battle of Loudon Hill, the Siege of Roxburgh Castle in 1314, the Siege of Berwick Castle in 1318, which the Scots hung on to until 1333, and most famously, the Battle of Bannockburn. In his life, Robert would name 3 different heirs. First, in 1315, with no male children, Robert named his brother Edward Bruce as heir presumptive. However, in 1318, Edward was killed in Ireland at the Battle of Fahart, at which point Robert went again to Parliament. And as he still had no sons, he made his new heir presumptive his young grandson, Robert Stewart, son of his late daughter Marjorie, and her husband, Walter the Sixth High Steward of Scotland. In 1324, however, he finally had a son with his wife, Elizabeth de Burgh. They named him David, and upon Robert the Bruce's death in June of 1329, the young boy went on to be King David II of Scotland.
All of that said, how do we want to kick off this discussion about Robert the Bruce's reign?
This was all based on a rebel kingdom. If you think about it, Robert the Bruce took the throne with, limited, really not particularly strong reasons. He was encouraged to do so by the Scottish Church, particularly by the bishops of Glasgow, and they made him go, quick, get to Scone and we'll get that crown on you and then you'll be sorted.
I know he's got the backing of the Bishop of Glasgow. That's Bishop Wishart, isn't it? I always wonder what the opinion of the other nobles were about this guy who's a murderer. As we know, he's murdered John Comyn in a church. Are they thinking, oh my God, we better not mess with this boy because he's deadly serious? Or are they thinking, I'm not sure if I really want to be involved in this because he could drag me down with him? So I've always wondered what the opinion of the majority of the nobles were and whether they were just more like, I don't say steamroller, that's not quite the right word, but things just happened out of their control, like the events just took over. I mean, I was actually quite surprised reading up on the Declaration of Arbroath. It didn't have as much support as that would make you suggest. It wasn't 100% everybody's on Bruce's side. In fact, William Soulis was one of the guys who signed it, was definitely planning a coup against Bruce. So I wonder how much support he actually had at the point that he gets crowned. How many people are actually on his side?
That's an interesting... I think we mentioned this in the background information a little bit, but that's one of the contributing factors into the Battle of Methven, isn't it? There's a number of Scottish nobles that don't react well to Bruce's murder of John Comyn, and Methven's only a couple of months after Bruce's coronation, and there's a handful of important Scottish nobles that are involved on the opposing side in the Battle of Methven. So you know that there are at least a handful of them that not only are not approving of it, but don't just get steamrolled, that act against him.
I actually think that wasn't an unusual situation, because I don't think there was any king who was absolutely supported by everybody. I think they were struggling all the time to keep a hold of. I think we discussed at some point about how the Highlands weren't under control. The Lords of Galloway, that was obviously a bit earlier, but I don't think that had ever been settled. There was the constant disruptions of the borders. That was very difficult to police.
Do you get the impression that Bruce is, I may be going off a tangent here, but he's very much looking after number one, as opposed to Wallace, who I always think comes across as much more of a patriot?
I think historically it's really easy to say that because we know perhaps I think a little more about Robert the Bruce. So we have these records of Robert switching sides before he becomes king, and so fighting with William Wallace and then going to the English. And so it looks as if he's doing this for his own benefit. It doesn't look good for him. And
he wasn't alone in that, though, was he?
William Wallace, we don't know as much necessarily about his life, so it is a lot easier to just give him this blanket, he's fighting for Scotland. I mean, that's not to say that that isn't true, but I think it's easier to generalize for William Wallace than it is for Robert, because we don't technically have all of the historical ins and outs of William Wallace's life like we do for Robert the Bruce.
So you think we might have a slightly blinkered view of Wallace, whereas, like you say, Bruce we know so much more about?
I think so.
And I think it's important to remember too that if you're dealing with pretty much the same nobles, when Wallace and Andrew de Murray managed to defeat Edward's troops at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, right? They were given all great accolades and Guardian of Scotland and all these, things. I believe Andrew de Murray actually died of an arrow wound after that. I think it was blood poisoning he got after that battle, which was a great blow to Wallace. But Wallace then carried on, and eventually, I think it was a year later, he was in the Battle of Falkirk, which they lost. and immediately he was stripped of his honours, right? There's no memory, of the fact that he'd done this great thing by saving an awful lot of the castles, returning a lot of the Scottish castles back to their owners, etc., right? And that great battle. So he was stripped of it because he wasn't necessarily a noble, but also that kind of shows the same people that we're dealing with Bruce, right? So does it not make you think that Bruce just had to take the bull by the horns? These guys were never going to agree.
I think I have this image of Robert the Bruce as the ends justify the means type of man. So perhaps less selfish than he is, thinking to himself it's worth it if it's going to get maybe me to where I need to be, but also Scotland to where it needs to be. So yeah, he does what he needs to do to be king, which is, for good or for ill. But then once he is king, there are various things, let's say his tactic of castle destruction, which is really unique to him and really interesting, where he essentially has people destroying their own castles throughout Scotland so that the English don't capture them. And unfortunately for us, so many years later, it is, a large part of the reason why there are very few fortifications left in Scotland that are pre-14th century. But it's also one of the main reasons why England wasn't able to just sweep up through Scotland and take large swathes of land in the early 14th century, because he was doing this. And it's really radical. Even now we look back at it as really radical. You can't imagine what they would have thought when they were spending, these nobles were spending fortunes, their entire fortunes on building these castles and then told to tear them down. But it worked. So
he is one hell of a war leader. I mean, there probably hadn't been anybody quite like him. Like you say, this idea of destroying our own castles and convincing the guys who had built them that you're now going to take this thing apart. Like you say, they spent a fortune on it. That's unprecedented, isn't it? So I guess needs must, like you said. He's the man for the moment, isn't he? He's for the times. He's the right man in the right place, I suppose. I
could also add in that Robert the Bruce takes the crown because it's also part of his family to take what they want. That's not good. No. Compared to his mother, right? So his mother, Marjorie, was the Countess of Carrick in her own right. And just to put it into geographical context, where Dundonald Castle is South Ayrshire, and it used to be called Kyle and Carrick. And she was already married to and had a daughter before he died. He was called Adam. He went out to the Ninth Crusade and died. There's two stories. One of them was, I think this guy had turned up at her door delivering the message, right, about the death of her husband, and she liked him so much she didn't let him leave and kept him as a prisoner until he agreed to marry her. And the other story, which I'm not sure you listeners, you can decide which one you prefer. The other one is that she was looking out the window of Turnberry Castle, which looks out onto the beach, and she saw a man on a horse going along without a shirt on, and she shouted, "Men, go and grab him, find out who he is and bring him immediately to me." So this man was captured and taken to the castle, and it turned out to be, basically he was called Bruce de Bruce. He was a Norman noble, well, not that high ranking, and again the story is she kept him captive until he agreed to marry her, and he did, and that was Robert the Bruce's father. So the point being, if Robert Bruce was influenced by his mother to take what he wanted. It sounds like one of these really tacky stories, but actually there's quite a lot of documentation about it.
I can see him on the horse riding down the beach, like on the front of a romance novel.
Who's the guy that came out of the lake in Pride and Prejudice? I've got him on my mind.
Mr. Darcy.
Mr. Darcy.
Yeah. Colin Firth? Colin Firth. Yeah, I just got a picture of him riding along Turnberry Beach on a horse.
That I wouldn't mind.
So basically, I don't know which was worse, the stories. One, if she had taken the man from the beach, at least she wasn't seducing the man who brought her the news about the death of her husband. To me, that's a much darker story. So, in terms of disrespect, if he'd come all the way from the Holy Land to bring her this news, because he'd been on the crusade apparently with her husband.
I do think you see a bit of Bruce's mother in him, don't you? He is definitely a strong character, and he certainly rises to the challenge of his situation, doesn't he? In the sense that he was willing to do almost anything that was necessary, and that meant sacrificing just about everyone that was close to him, whether he wanted to or not. It happened, and he kept going, and he was willing to sacrifice the castles of Scotland. He was willing to fight in a way that may not have appeared chivalrous or modern to the rest of Europe, with guerrilla warfare tactics.
That's exactly what it was. Yeah, that's exactly what it was.
And he was able to pull out, I don't know if you'd call it a victory from the First War of Independence, but certainly not a complete loss. And I do think that is largely because of him. It wasn't just a mistake. I think it could have ended up very different if they had someone else on the throne, because of him, because of his personality.
He lost everything. He lost his brothers were hung, drawn and quartered. His wife and his sisters and his daughter were put in hideous, conditions. So horrible. He had a terrible time. I mean, he lost. I think the worst part is him having his brothers put to death. I think that's absolutely, well, there's 4 of them, I think, or 3 of them hung, drawn and quartered. Absolutely horrific. And that still didn't stop him, and I don't blame him. I suppose once you get to that stage, you have to carry on for vengeance in some way, and for some, you need to make it worth their while. And maybe they had a code. Maybe they had a code between them that said, "Look, we're going to just do this. We're not going to give up. We've went this far. What choice do we have?" And it looked to me as if
he's at the point of no return, isn't he?
Back from Scotland.
He's going to end up the same as his brothers, so he's at the point of no return, really.
I was going to say it's lasted in our minds, in our imagination, and in our kind of national pride ever since then, right? We felt as though, because I mean, if he hadn't done what he did, Scotland may not exist as we speak about it today. We would probably all still think it is and still talk about it as if it is. But I believe that the strength that they had to put, the shoulder was to the wheel at that point. If they hadn't done that, then they wouldn't have been able to hold on to Scotland. Edward I had almost an insatiable desire to kind of destroy the nobility, taking away the Stone of Destiny on the regalia, in a kind of mad belief that there would be no more kings and therefore he could rule. Yeah,
to sort of dismantle the place as a country. It no longer exists as a country as far as he's concerned, Because, like Gwen just said, he takes away the Stone of Destiny, which is where the Scottish kings are crowned. This is where their coronation takes place. They're sitting on top of the Stone of Destiny. So he takes it away because, as far as he's concerned, now you no longer need this. So he takes away all the regalia around the coronation. He takes away the piece of the Black Rood, the piece of what they think is the true cross, because in Scotland you don't need that anymore, because you're now no longer an independent country. And he takes the Stone of Destiny and he actually has it built into coronation chair in England. And this thing is there to crown the English kings first of all, and then later the British kings after James VI / James I. And they're all crowned sitting on this chair, which has the Stone of Destiny built into it, until 1950, when it's stolen by a bunch of students, believe it or not. And I think it's hidden in somewhere in Kent, I think, for a while, if I've got the story right. And eventually it finds its way back up into Scotland, having been broken into 2 bits accidentally. And it eventually finds its way back up to Scotland. Although another story goes that actually wasn't it, but it was actually hidden before Edward got hold of it, and this is another one. I don't know, maybe a spare one they had lying around or something, but whatever.
Extra giant stone.
Money takes your choice, but Edward certainly believed that he had the original one, and by taking that away, he was taking Scotland away as an independent country.
And there's double meaning to that, isn't there? He's taking away, and by putting it under his own chair, he's both insulting Scotland as saying, look at this, I'm using your stone in my own coronation. And he's also saying to the people of England, look, Scotland is now subservient to us.
Absolutely.
There's so much meaning behind that. It's really, really potent.
It actually has caused an enormous amount of rage in Scotland when people knew about it. So if you imagine when people woke up on Christmas morning in 1950 and discovered it had been stolen, there's a lot of cheering, and the headlines were quite different south and north of the border about that incident.
So let's talk a little bit about Robert the Bruce's legacy then, and how this man's life and deeds and personality moved on through his two heirs, his son David and his grandson Robert Stewart.
And he was he was determined not to capitulate at any cost. And I think that was another discussion we had, that we felt that maybe his son David was prepared to capitulate. And then we moved to Robert, his grandson, who wasn't prepared to capitulate. So there was a sense where they had, you know, skipped a generation or had different influences and stuff like that. But I feel as if Robert the Bruce was absolutely determined. But the thing that interested me about Robert the Bruce was when he was on his deathbed in 1329, he had belief that he was ashamed of all the murders and the death. Probably that murder particularly was on his conscience, and he asked for his heart to be removed, to be taken to put into the sarcophagus with Jesus Christ, right? So they could, like, somehow, I don't know, curry favour when he got over to the other side. And that tells you quite a lot. And it makes me imagine that the part of it we probably don't appreciate is that there's an enormous, I mean, I suppose we might think of it now as being almost superstitious, right? But people genuinely had this enormous kind of belief that they would go to the afterworld and they would be judged, and they would have this, you know, their conscience and their soul was so vital.
Totally they did. Yeah.
We could sit all day and talk about what we know from reading chronicles, and
especially for a guy that is not only murdered his competitor, he's murdered him in a church, you know. I mean, you know, how many boxes do you want to tick if you want to get yourself into hell?
He probably thought his ghost was booked.
But I think that's an interesting way to, and I've never really thought about it, but the fact that he almost sends his heart, or asks for his heart to be sent on pilgrimage, and it ends up being a type of crusade, and that, you know, just about everyone there gets slaughtered. You know, they end up in this big skirmish, and it's funny to see how that rubs off on his son, because his son does have sort of crusading ideals at the core of who he is, and we don't necessarily associate that with Robert the Bruce, do we? But that story, I think, shows that was something that mattered to him, and that was something that was passed along to his son that perhaps we don't give his son much credit for.
Very good point. That's really that's something, you know, I hadn't thought about either. But maybe he was also trying to redeem his father's conscience as well. We don't know what his parents might have said, his mother, the grandparents, things said to him, and even Robert, his uncle, might have said to him, "This is up to you. This is up to you, son. You need to redeem your father's soul." We don't know what kind of things they passed on. We do hear that phrase, "sins of the father" and all that, right? That's a really strange old-fashioned phrase to us, but it does come from somewhere. Interestingly, we're obviously in Ayrshire, and the only person that survived from that trip of taking Bruce's heart was a guy called, he was a knight called, his surname Keith, basically one of the knights, and he was from Galston in Ayrshire, right? His family had sent him from that fantastic castle in Galston that just sits there. But they had all that land. It was the village, and the town wasn't there then. And he went there to the Crusades, and they were waylaid in Spain, and they had to assist this King Alfonso, who was going to get a lot of trouble with the Moors encroaching on his lands. He said, "Look, give us a hand, guys, and let's get rid of them." And he fell off his horse the day before, apparently, and broke his arm. He was saying, well, you know, he was excused from battle. So his job, this is a really dark story, every one of them was brought back. His job was to bring them all home to their families throughout Scotland, all these young sons, all these, it was dreadful. And they had to boil their bones up in vinegar to get all the flesh off it, because it had to be see for years, right? And then they wrapped them then in the tabard so they knew who they were. So if you ever go into Ross Lynn, now I'm particularly interested in Ross Lynn, obviously because I'm a Sinclair. There's William Sinclair's in there, and it's a wee tiny stone casket. That's why, because all it's in there is his bones, and he's from that battle. He was killed, which is really sad. So this is a horrible job. He had to come home and then deliver all these bodies parts to the families throughout Scotland.
So that would explain his nickname, Stinky Keith, then. Yeah, now
I think it's a bit of it, but that was all his pals. I think that's a heady story.
Isn't it funny? Gwen's just made a really interesting point, actually, that I hadn't really picked up on before, that David is prepared effectively to capitulate, but he's supposed to be the chivalrous one. He's supposed to be the much more of a warlike leader, whereas Robert is supposed to be a little bit of a softy, the guy that ran away, and he's the one who isn't prepared to capitulate. He's certainly going to find a way out of it if he can. Yeah, Robert Stewart. Yeah,
I think that has a lot to do with David wanting so desperately to be connected with Europe. I think he is more interested in being connected with England and more interested in being connected with Europe. And that also has something to do with the fact that he's more willing to give the Scottish throne to people in England. He spent loads of time in England, whether that was his choice or not. He spent a large portion of his youth in France. So I think he probably sees himself as much more European, certainly than Robert Stewart, and possibly more European than his father did. So he probably is more interested in this European chivalric code of the 14th century than perhaps his father or his nephew.
Possibly. I get the feeling you're being a little bit easy on him. I wonder if he just wants to be let back to Scotland so he can be the King of Scotland, because he hasn't been the king in Scotland for very long, has he? I mean, he was hiding in France, and then he came back for a bit, and then he got himself captured at Neville's Cross. He's hardly got going, and I could be wrong, and you could well be right, but I think you're giving him an easy time, and I think he just wants to get back to Scotland so he can start being a king, and I'll just do anything to get back.
I'm not meaning to be nice to him. I guess the picture of him in my head is like this little guy among the big fancy kings of Europe, and he just so desperately wants to be the cool kid that he's willing to give up whatever he needs to play with the big kids.
I would also suggest the slightly darker side of things. If he'd been held captive, right, then he would have been given a lot of gaslighting. He'd have been getting told all sorts of things about his own father, who was an absolute arch enemy of the Edwards. So he would have been given an awful lot of stories and disparaging comments. And in fact, the Edwards, I don't know if it was Edward II and III, which it would be Edward III at this point, he called all his jesters Robert, right, regardless of where they came from or what their real names were. So I like to assume because of Robert the Bruce.
Yeah,
I know. And if you imagine if David was allowed potentially, if you think about, say, the Tower of London, for example, even have been allowed to come into the court at some point to mingle, because he was royalty, Scottish royalty, and he was probably related to quite a lot of the people in there as well. And he may well have heard these, jesters who were called Robert, and he may well have thought that's my da. That's my da. If he spoke like that, I hope he did.
So we go from David II, who we think is probably not very much like his father at all, to Robert. And I said this in the background, but Robert Stewart is Robert the Bruce's grandson. And he goes on to be Robert II, and he's pretty important to us because he built our castle. And if you haven't listened to our first episode of our podcast, you should do so, because we talk pretty extensively about Robert Stewart and the man that we think he is. But how is Robert II, or how do we think Robert II takes after his grandfather? What do we think he got from Robert the Bruce?
To me, Robert comes across much more as a wheeler dealer, second-hand car salesman. He'll always cut you a deal. He's less of a warrior than Robert Bruce. Now, whether that's just because the times are different by then, so he hasn't needed to. Perhaps he's found a different way around things, but I could be completely wrong. But I don't really see many similarities between Robert Bruce and Robert Stewart.
Personality-wise, I think that Robert Stewart, and we talked a little bit about this in our original one, I think that he was perhaps more connected with the Gaelic population certainly than David II, but even more than Robert the Bruce. I think Robert the Bruce had more of a connection to, we'd say the Norman court, but the English court and the European court than Robert Stewart was.
I've seen Robert Stewart described as a hybrid, so he would speak Lowland Scots, but he also could converse. I understand with the Gaels as well. He can converse in Gaelic as well. The people on the Western Isles.
So there was something. Oh yeah, there was something else I wanted to add. Right, there was something to add to Robert's generosity that I discovered, because obviously I'm writing a lot of these blogs, and I'm doing a lot of research, and I'm always trying to build this picture of the person and the people and etc., etc. And it turns out that Robert II spent a lot of money making a really fantastic kind of sarcophagus, I guess you would call it, in Edinburgh for David II. Right, he pulled all the money together. He wanted to make it wonderful in marble. Right, why did he need to bother? If I think he was probably more respectful to David than because of David's father, I would say, but also than he was to him. And so we're left feeling slightly uncertain about poor David's life, right? You do feel sorry for the guy who's away in prison, but then I don't necessarily feel sorry for him in that he seemed to be selling his father's enormous legacy out quite easily. I feel as if he could just have given it away with a wee sniff of freedom for himself.
He makes it really easy for Robert Stewart, I think, to then buy into I am grandson of Robert the Bruce. You know, we said we don't know for sure if Robert Stewart commissioned the John Barber's The Bruce, which is basically a massive, you know, praise of Robert the Bruce's life and deeds, which is something that's
certainly what we're told, isn't it? You know, would have probably been read in the castle here, actually, at Dundonald as well. I could imagine it being read there. And I think what you said is a really good point. And I think David's made it really easy for Robert to say, this guy is going to sell the crown to the English. He's going to sell off the family silver. He's everything that my granddad, Robert Bruce, fought for. He's going to sell it down the Swanee for his convenience. You know, I'm the man that you need to be putting your backing behind, because I'm not going to do that. Yeah,
David was in prison. Robert would have been the one doing the grafting to keep it all together.
Poor David must be desperate. Yeah. I mean, he's been trying to produce a kid. He can't, because he spent 10 years at least in prison. You know, and it must be like almost every month the message comes and said, Robert's produced another kid, don't you? You know, it's just endless.
I mean, that is the grafting. I mean, I said he was running the country, doing all the proclamations and sorting out all the fights and feuds and land and titles. I wasn't actually reading that type of grafting. But that too, let's add that in, absolutely.
I mean, you can see why he's. I mean, that's the idea of selling off the crown to the English. I'm sure he's just becoming desperate, because he can't see any other way out of it, because he can't produce any kids, because he's not been able to when he's been out, and now he's stuck in prison, although probably fairly quite a nice life, but he still can't get back to do what he wants to be doing. I think the poor fellow's just completely desperate.
After David II's reign and the troubles Robert Stewart had with David II during his reign, I think that Robert really wanted to take pains to show people that, yeah, perhaps David and himself hadn't gotten along, but Robert the Bruce is the man that mattered, and Robert the Bruce, you know, was his grandfather. And we do know that Robert the Bruce named him as heir presumptive. So there was a relationship there. And, you know, in his lifetime, Robert was 13 when Robert the Bruce died, and David was 5. So Robert Stewart had a lot more time to get to know Robert the Bruce than David did. We pretty much just need to find a way to wrap up and do a why is Robert the Bruce, why is this topic important to us?
If we're talking about why he's important now, he's speaking as an Englishman. It's quite clear that he is a focus of Scottish pride, isn't he? You know, he's something that Scottish people return to all the time as an example of who we are, what we can be if we need to. We know he's seen as a hero, and I think he's seen, if you like, as you could almost say, he's the father of Scotland, because it almost had a reboot, didn't it, during the Bruce time? It could have all gone completely to pot, and he stopped it going to pot, and he somehow held the country together. Now, whether you think he was a particularly good person or or not. We've touched on what he did in the church. He's probably not a particularly nice person, but sometimes you don't need a person. You know, that saying, "Cometh the hour, cometh the man." I think he was the right person in the right place at the right time, and I think that is why he's so important to Scottish people now. Speaking as an outsider, if you like, that's certainly an outsider's view of how I see him towards Scottish people. He is that focal point of Scottish pride.
I think he certainly is, and if you also imagine that he has been the subject of very many, pieces of prose, music, song, and stories and legends, and particularly thinking about Robert Burns' poem, which was put to music, called Scots Go Hey, which was the imaginary or potentially based on legendary address to his soldiers, troops at Bannockburn. Everything's about, now's the day and now's the hour, and all this really strong kind of emotive words to encourage. But when we hear that, it actually, I feel it. I think, that's so incredibly powerful. But that was Robbie Burns, another Ayrshirman, who'd written this about what he would have imagined or potentially had heard it been said.
Getting a little more specific, why is he important to us at Dundonald Castle? Apart from the obvious that he was massively important in the Wars of Independence, that he is a symbol for Scotland, why is he important to us at Dundonald Castle?
And apart from the fact that he's Bob's granddad.
That's it.
He links us back to Robert II, doesn't he?
Yeah.
And what a grandfather to have. I'm well jealous.
Right.
And of course, we have in the prison, in the pit, we have the cave spiders. I bet he brought one of those back on his cloak, and they are the descendants of Robert Bruce's spider.
And so he was hiding out down in our pit, which anyone who hasn't been to Dundonald
I think he popped in for a coffee, and he had the spider on his cloak, and then two of them, obviously one of each, and they bred in the castle.
Like a Noah's Ark for spiders.
Yeah.
And he said, if at first, this is what he passed on to Robert II. If at first you don't succeed, try again. Yeah. Everyone get taught that at school. It was a kind of bog standard. That was basically our Scottish history. Was Robert the Bruce speaking watching the spider, and it kept, it didn't make its web, and eventually it spotted it, and he decided to come back from wherever he was hiding potentially. Yeah. But people have said it's Bruce's Cave in Arran. People say it was just off the coast of Northern Ireland. So
Rathlin, yeah.
And then he came back and did win Scotland back again. So it's a good story. But the cave spiders, that's a really good connection to him as well, because that is strange about those spiders actually.
I mean, it's just a nice little connection, isn't it? There's the story of Robert in the cave watching the cave spider. And then in Dundonald Castle, his grandson's castle, we've got this little group of cave spiders, presumably the same type of spider that Robert Bruce was watching. So it's just a nice little connection, isn't it?
I think that's all we have then about Robert the Bruce. I want to thank everyone for sticking with us through another episode of Tales from the Castle podcast. Very special thanks to Dave for joining us yet again for another episode. If you're interested in following Dave on Twitter, he has a very interesting Twitter feed. And Dave, could you share with us your Twitter handle?
It is at DT297.
Right. So if you want to follow Dave, it's at DT297, as he says, and he's always tweeting very interesting things about the castle. So have a follow.
And I'm desperate for followers.
And if you have any questions about anything that we have covered today, feel free to reach out to me, Blythe, at education@dundonaldcastle.org.uk. And again, thanks to my special co-host, Gwen, for joining me yet again today. And thanks everyone for joining us again. And we will be with you soon. Bye!
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 That was cute. The Tales from the Castle podcast is recorded with and on behalf of the Friends of Dundonald Castle. However, all thoughts and opinions expressed in the podcast are our own. Our theme song comes from Blacksmith, composed by Alexander Nakarada, and can be accessed in full online on serpentsoundstudios.com. The Friends of Dundonald are a registered charity, SCIO number SC031541. If you are interested in learning more about Dundonald Castle or supporting our charity, please see our website, dundonaldcastle.org.uk, or follow us on social media. We can be found on Facebook at Dundonald Castle and Visitor Centre, on Instagram at Dundonald_Castle, on Twitter at Dundonald Castle, or on our YouTube channel, Dundonald Castle Education. Thank you so much.